Okay, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So welcome back after the snow cancellation last week. Sorry about that. Or it wasn't even snow, it was just cold. Okay, so I guess we have some more snow coming. All right, well, so in between the bad weather, we have the privilege of learning with Rabbi David Levinsky. He has been here before. I know most of you have had the opportunity to study with him and have thoroughly enjoyed it. So just by way of reintroduction, Rabbi Levinsky is the Associate Rabbi at Chicago's Sinai congregation downtown, and also has a doctorate in religious studies and Talmud from Stanford University. So he's a very learned man and an interesting teacher, and he's going to be teaching us for 2 sessions, today and then next week, on the topic of belief in God. So let's welcome Rabbi Levinsky.
You're welcome. So there's a tension that's built right into the way that this course is titled and structured, which is a tension that's built into Judaism. And this is the tension in between the obligation to do the commandments and a feeling of what we would call spirituality, or what the rabbis would call kavanah, intentionality, which is behind the commandments. And we see this in the way the class is structured. Part of it is ben adam l'makom, between human beings and God. That's the spirituality side. That's the fuel for the fire, so to speak. But the goal ultimately is ben adam l'chavero, is to go out there and do things, do commandments, and improve relationships and improve the world, right? And these two need to work hand in hand in Judaism for the system to work. The risk on the Reform Jewish side is that we're all spirit and no action. I mean, that's definitely the way that classical Reform Judaism ended up going towards in the 19th and the early 20th century. There's been a bit of a swing back to the right, which is trying to adjust that, right? But you have a situation where really your Jewishness is, well, I feel that I'm Jewish. Oh, and I like Judaism, and you get the point. I mean, have you lit Shabbat candles this year? You know, has there been anything, whether it be about traditional mitzvot or even an expanded definition into social justice or Talmud Torah, right? Studying Torah. Has there been anything that you've actually done that's Jewish? That becomes the risk in the Reform, is that we don't do anything. We talk a great talk, but we don't do much. On the other side of the equation, in more traditional forms of Judaism, a real risk of the matter is that they're doing a lot. You wake up in the morning, and the first thing you do is you ritually wash your hands and say a bracha. And then there are the morning blessings to say. I mean, technically, Jewish law tells you which shoe to put on first in the morning. It does. The right, by the way, in case you were wondering. Right? So, right is the side of mercy. You want to start with mercy, right? You want to start with judgment. So, it's a pretty detailed system. So you're doing all these things all day if you're a very traditional Jew, but there's a risk that it ultimately becomes something that's sort of ossified and frozen and doesn't have much meaning or spirituality. It's just what you do. It's just what you've always done. It's what your family did, right? Yeah. So there becomes a strong need for, how can I put it, spiritual fuel or spiritual energies behind the performance of mitzvot. And really the strongest response to this problem in traditional Judaism has been what we've come to call Kabbalah. Although the term doesn't really apply until about the 12th century, and technically it really refers to the form of Jewish mysticism which is coming out of southern France and northern Spain and around the 11th through the 13th century. Period where a text called the Zohar is written. That's the technical definition of what Kabbalah is. It's obviously come to be used in a much more broad sense in our contemporary society, And in Jewish society, and even general society, due to Rabbi Philip Berg, who's brought it to the non-Jews in Los Angeles, of course, and where else, right? But so Kabbalah has really come to be a blanket term for what I would call Jewish mysticism. And in the religious studies world, I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions about what is mysticism. In the Jewish studies world, in the religious studies world, when we define mysticism, it's actually fairly simple. It's a form of religiosity that is striving for a direct experience with the divine. Right? So you want to not only be doing something, you want to experience God while doing it. That's the goal of mysticism. There's a lot of different ways to get there, right? But that is the goal. So as you can see, is going back to the problem, the tension that I talked about within traditional Jewish communities, Kabbalah in a lot of ways serves as what we call in religious studies a series of revitalization movements. As Judaism becomes sort of frozen and ossified, or even corrupt, which was the case in Europe when the Hasidim arrived, when it becomes frozen or ossified, Kabbalah tends to step in an attempt to revitalize Judaism. This is something that Reform Judaism and Kabbalah share. One could argue that Reform Judaism, in its way, at least in its sort of 1820s to 1840s German variety, was very much a revitalization movement as well, but with very different goals than Kabbalah, right? But nonetheless. These are the cycles of the way that religion works in society. So it tends to sort of freeze up, become too institutionalized. With institutions come corruption. And then the revitalization movement comes in and tries to sweep things clean and get some spirit back and get back to the roots of what this thing is all about. And Kabbalah has always served a function similar to that. What I want to look at today is a variety of Kabbalah, which is really one of the most, I'll call it this. Now I'm not being religious studies because I'm being so judgmental. A rather extreme form of religious practice and a rather extreme goal within religiosity. All right? And in order to talk about this to a large degree, I need to ask you to throw out a lot of the major frameworks that you use to understand the world around you. And you may not even realize that these frameworks are things that you use to understand the world around you because they are such a vital part, such vital lenses into your universe. All right? Number one, science. All right? It's a modern introduction, right? Very recent phenomenon. For the vast, vast majority of the history of Judaism, science has not been a lens of Jews or even Israelites before that who were looking at the world. All right? So we can bring science in. That's fine. But I want us to bring it in recognizing that we're bringing it in. Not as assumed knowledge. All right? So if you bring science in as we're having our discussion, recognize that you're doing it. Right? So, say it. I'm bringing science in here. What about? Okay? So I asked that. The other is psychology. Psychology is so much a part of the way that we think about the world and we don't even know it. Probably very few people here have read Freud or Jung. I won't do a show of hands and embarrass people, right? But at the same time, the very language you use about humanity derives from 19th century psychological thought. For instance, the concept of the self, right? That's an assumption that I have an individuated self and that it's positive for me to integrate and strengthen that self. That's Freud. Before him, that wasn't an idea that was out there in the world at all. All right, so again, if we're using psychological assumptions and someone who wants something other than integrating and strengthening the self is aberrant, right? Crazy. Right? So again, when we use, if we want to use those lenses, fine, but let's mention that we're using it beforehand, all right? What I want to try to get us aware of, I guess, is sort of a meta-awareness about how we look at the world as we're doing it. So, taking more of an anthropological look at the world, recognizing that we have these cultural and intellectual lenses that we look at the world through, and they are not true with the capital T. They're our truth as a society and as individuals, all right? All right, so there's my precursor there. So what are we looking at? We're going to be looking at visionary mysticism. One of the primary ways where Israelites and Jews have experienced the divine historically, from the time of the biblical prophets to the present, although not so much in modernity. This has gone out of style because the lenses that we use to look at the world look askance at this type of thing. But for thousands and thousands of years, one of the primary ways that Israelites and Jews experienced the divine was through having visions of the divine. All right? And we have a vast amount of Jewish literature on this subject, and the vast majority of it we never look at. Why? Because it doesn't fit in the way we look at the world. You know, if one of your friends is like, you know, what did you do last night? Oh, you know, I was watching some TV, but then I turned off the TV and I sat down and, you know, I had the prophet Elijah sat on the sofa next to me and we had a conversation. You know, how would you react to this person? Right? Elijah is all over the Talmud. He's a regular character. He's all, you know, it's like the rabbis go to the market, they bump into Elijah. It's like, you know, it's like buying an apple. You know? So obviously their view of these things is vastly different than ours. I had a woman who's a congregant come in to ask for an appointment, and she had an appointment with me last week. She comes in the office, and she describes to me in very clear terms, with vivid descriptions of the people involved, that she believes that two men are following her. All right? These are the facts as presented with vivid details. She had gone up and talked to them once, told me the conversation. I'm a rabbi, I need to stay neutral, but I need to take care of her. So what I said was, I can think of two possibilities here. One possibility is these men are real, in which case you should talk to the police. Have you spoken to the police? Yes, I did. She tells the story of talking to the police. The police were fantastic with her as far as telling her what to do about this. Took her seriously, which is awesome, right? Right? Took her seriously. And I said, the other possibility is that this is not real. And I think you should also pursue that as a possibility and call your primary care physician when you get home and get a referral with someone that you can talk about this with, right? I don't know if it's real or not when they're walking in. What if it is something that's real and she ends up getting hurt? I have to pursue that, right? But a lot of what also informed me talking to her is my awareness of this literature. Right? People have experiences which our society would say are not real or are mental illness or something like that all the time. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's the psychological lens. Psychological lens is great. It's helped so many people, not saying anything negative about it, right? I mean, it's like the greatest Jewish invention of the past 200 years other than communism. So. Those are our two big ones, right? The past 200 years, basically. So, I guess the theory of relativity would be in that. All right, so that's by way of an introduction. Before I pass out this material, I feel like if I just passed out this material and we'd taken a look at it, maybe you guys wouldn't have been so on the page, right? So I needed to do a little bit of a lengthy warm-up. Really the earliest Jewish texts that we have, it's questionable calling these Jewish. Probably Israelite is a better term at this point. It's debatable whether there's a Judaism in the 6th century BC or not at the time of the biblical prophets. If so, it's developing up in Babylonia and is by no means how can I put it, a widely spread out phenomenon, right? So I'll say Israelite religion to play it safe, all right? And this is an Israelite text, not necessarily a Jewish text. We think of it as such, meaning we think of it as a Jewish text, the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah and Ezekiel in particular are incredibly vibrant and ecstatic visionaries. I'm not really sure there's just one of these guys either. It could very well be a sort of school of prophecy, right? And the stuff gets collected under the title of the leader Isaiah, right? There's a debate in academia about that. I tend to go for the multiple author thing, but there are very good scholars who believe in single authorship of Isaiah, like Benjamin Summers at Northwestern believes in single authorship of Isaiah. In any case, there's a debate about it. The more relevant topic is, what we're about to see is a text that all of us have seen, all of us have spoken, probably numerous times. If you've gone to Shabbat services on Saturday ever, you've said it. And now we're going to read it in context, but we're going to read it in context with a different lens on. We're not going to be on autopilot reading the book, reading the words of the Siddur, but we're going to be thinking about it in terms of Isaiah having a vision of God. All right? So that's what's going on in the text. So let me pass these out. I think I kept the piece of paper that I wrote my Delta Airlines ID on over there. So there we go. All right. So it's in the little second isolated paragraph that we see our favorite text. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevot, Melech ha'aretz Kevodo. Chol ha'aretz. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. For those who grew up with the UPB, the whole earth is full of God's glory. Right? That's the next phrase. We have different translation here. His presence fills all the earth. Same meaning. Of course, the language from the UPB is more beautiful than this translation. That goes without saying. It's the highest form of English language prayer in the history of Judaism. I doubt we'll ever touch it. Obviously, the movement has moved away from English language prayer, and that's not a major concern. But those guys really hit it. There's some absolutely incredible language in there. And they were all guys. The women had not been invited to the rabbi party yet. So, all right. So now let's read the whole text. So that comes from the section of prayer called the Kedusha. It's the third blessing of the Amidah, or the standing prayer. In every synagogue in America, even at Sinai, we stand up during this particular section of the service. And there's this call and response. It's done in different ways. It'd be done differently in an Orthodox synagogue, and I'll get to that in a second, than it would be done in a Reform synagogue. But nonetheless, it's this call and response. And there are three congregational responses. This one, the Baruch Kavod one, and the Adonai Yimloch one. There's those three that you would say together in response to the Shliach Tzibur, to the leader of prayer, saying other sections of prayer. On Shabbat, it'd be the whole Nikadesh et Sham Shimcha Be'olam, that whole section, right? All right. Probably know the Bon Yeshur melody for that. That's the one that took over the Reform movement. All right. So let's read this in context. I'm going to read it because even though what I'm going to be reading is going to be English, there's a need for a little bit of ideational translation. Right? Just because we understand every word doesn't mean we understand what's going on. Right? That's often a key with ancient texts. So I'm going to read, even though I'd love to stop talking and have one of you read. So in the year King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. It's the key sentence. This is the theme that we're going to be following through up into the 4th century. I have two other texts we're going to look at today. One from a Jewish, one from a Christian context, where we're going to follow up on this concept of the vision of God on the throne. This is one of the major forms of visionary mysticism that we have in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean and into the late ancient Eastern Mediterranean. Basically, if you are a holy man or a holy woman, one of the main ways that you prove this is by ascending into the heavens and having a vision of the throne of God. Everybody's doing it. Paul does it in his letters, right? So it's not only happening in the Jewish context, but broadly, ascending to the heavens and seeing the Godhead, seeing God, sitting on the throne in this case, is a very standard religious experience for a religious leader to have. Rabbinic, non-rabbinic Jews, Christians, everybody's doing it. All right? So again, I'm trying to normalize this. It's just a part of religiosity. Today, rabbis go to HUC. Back in the day, they ascended to heaven and saw the throne of God. It's that sort of matter of fact. It is really a part of heightened religious spirituality that was accessible to the entire elite, to the entire religious elite, any religious adept. All right. And the skirts of his robe filled the temple. So here we need to describe. This makes, in a way, perfect sense if we understand the cultural context. The temple, since that's where the sacrifices happen on earth, right? The temple on earth is really the nexus between heaven and earth, because those sacrifices are the main way that we communicate and influence the divine. It plays the role that prayer does now. So it would make perfect sense that up in the heavens there's a parallel temple. And there's a bunch of literature about this in what we call the apocryphal literature written essentially between the early strata of the Bible and the rabbinic texts that didn't end up in the Torah. All right? So it was edited out. Thank God the Christians, the Catholics saved a ton of this stuff, so we have it. So it's really useful. They call it intertestamental because it's between the Old and the New Testaments. But since we don't buy the New Testament, we tend to call it apocryphal literature. Essentially, it's actually not a good title for it either. It's literature outside of the biblical canon from the biblical period. It's literally what it is. So we have this temple up in the heavens, and that's really where Isaiah has made his journey. He's gone up and he's inside the heavenly temple. He's in the throne room. He sees God sitting there. God has these marvelous robes that flow so far that they're not just filling the throne room, but they're flowing out into the entire temple. It's a really beautiful vision. There are seraphim standing in attendance around him, which are divine beasties of some sort, divine creatures. We tend to forget that the Israelites were backed into monotheism. They were not particularly interested in it. There were all kinds of divine creatures in the heavens. Various angels and B'nai Elohim and all kinds of creatures are up there essentially serving as God's retinue. God's the boss, right? And it's clear that Yahweh is better than the other gods, right? But there are other divine creatures up there. This whole monotheism thing comes in later than often makes contemporary Jews comfortable, right? So that's what's going on. There are seraphim, these divine creatures, and they're in attendance around God. Each of them has 6 wings, with 2 wings. With their top 2 wings, they cover God's face. With their middle wings, they cover God's. With 2 legs, they cover their torso, God's torso. His legs. You can also translate legs as genitalia. It's a euphemism. So they're covering God's face and genitalia with their wings. It's an interesting concept that God has genitalia. Right? There's a scholar, Howard Albrook Schwartz, who wrote a book about this called God's Phallus. He did not get tenure. So we have children who are going into Jewish studies. Good cautionary tale. Okay? Brilliant scholar. So, but in any case, it wasn't just because of the God's Phallus. There were other issues. But so I hear through the academic rumor mill. But in any case, he did not get tenure. And then there's another set of wings so that they can fly. So they're sort of flying around the divine throne, covering up God. We have God portrayed in a way like a 1920s fan dancer or something. He's sort of hidden. But God clearly has a body, which is fascinating in and of itself, that one can see. So our conception of God tends to be very incorporeal, right? We don't think of God having a body. All right. And these seraphim who are alternating, covering up God's face and genitalia, have a little chant that they say across to each other, back and forth, and that is Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh Adonai Tzavod, Melo Kol Haaretz Kavodo. Brings a really different meaning to saying Kedusha, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure.
It's not, they don't teach you this one even at rabbinic school, folks. I had to get to this one on my own. This is not what I was taught in liturgy. Were you taught about this in liturgy? This visionary mysticism, straight up and down. No,
This will give me a new insight. I'm currently singing with Kol Zimra, and we're doing the Ernest Bloch setting to Kedusha with all of this text. So when I sing Kadosh, 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 it's going to be a different...
Well, that's the one thing that that's the practical takeaway that I'm bringing in here. The goal here that I'm really trying, I always give my punchline, somewhere, between 20 to 30% into the lesson. Because then you learn more about the lesson if you know what my punchline is early, right? Right? So I just don't understand the pedagogy of the grand conclusion that everybody walks out and they haven't integrated the whole time. Anyways, what I'm hoping is that there's a little bit of an opening up to the idea of religious experience as one of the resources we have in spirituality. And one of the resources we have to fuel our spiritual practice, whatever it may be. And that's really what I'm wanting, is that we open up a little bit to that possibility. And I'm not saying that we should all go sit out in a cornfield in Iowa and learn Abraham Abulafia's meditation practices and do them for 10 hours a day and have visions. That's not what I'm saying. Right? But what I'm saying is what was just shared over here. Right? Wow, I have a different perspective here, and I can think about that while I'm doing it, right? And maybe it'll be a little bit of a different experience. So ultimately that's that's a little bit of the goal of this particular lesson as far as teaching in the congregational community. It's not just an academic lesson. All right. So then the doorposts would shake at the sound of the one who called. They have these thundering, angelic voices. Of everything is shaking, and the house, meaning the temple, is filling up with smoke. So we've got a pretty intense scene going on here. And he cries out, "Woe is me, I'm lost, for I'm a man of impure lips." What essentially that means is I have transgressions on me, right? I'm a sinner, right? That's what he's saying. I'm scared. I am in the presence of God. Smoke is pouring in the room. The walls are shaking, and I'm perceiving myself as a sinner. So I'm scared. Yet my own eyes have beheld the King of Hosts. I'm in trouble now. I'm a sinner, and I've seen God. Of course, you would have to be completely ritually and ethically pure in order to have a vision of God, right? So then one of the seraphs flies over to me with a live coal, meaning with a burning coal, which he'd taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. So that's the sort of is the nexus between the two altars, the earthly and the heavenly one. And there are coals on the heavenly one as well. So he takes a coal off with tongs off of the heavenly altar, and he touches it to Isaiah's lips, the burning coal, and says, now that this has touched your lips, your guilt, your transgressions shall depart, and your sin be purged away. Wow, this is great literature, huh? All right. All right, so, okay, I've been talking a lot. Questions, comments? What essentially do we do with a visionary experience like this? I mean, there's a
The only thing I kept thinking of through this whole, and not the first time in my life, but the fact that there was a need to anthropomorphize God. God had to be tangible.
Right.
Which in my thinking, serves as a bridge between the gods who performed things for the ancients prior to the development of the Israelite community, and then ultimately the one God who we cannot see.
Right.
And the prophets then, now they're to be putting, in my thinking, in a different place in the whole structure of my personal religious belief. Where are they now? Now they're not just people that just wrote stuff in the 50s when I was in Sunday school and Reformed.
So you learned justice shall rain down like water from Amos, and all these great ethical lines from the prophets, which are really the core inspiration for Reformed Judaism. So we all learned them in religious school, yeah.
But were they a bridge, as my thinking is, between that ancient Greek Canaanite religiosity and those who came out of Egypt and developed something?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got two different questions going on there. The one is this question of the tension between what Judaism ultimately calls for, what I call a radical monotheism. A monotheism without representation of the divine, much less God having a body. But we can't even just represent God in any way. I mean, this is, I guess the culmination of this is in Maimonides' negative theology, where he essentially says we can't say anything about God. We can only speak about God in a double negative. Right? It's the only way we get there is, it's kissing the woman through the veil. You can only get to God through speaking in double negatives, right? So this incredibly abstract, indescribable, radically unified God is what we are called upon as contemporary Jews to believe in. And the reality is, I'm convinced, I'm going into science mode, our brains just don't work that way. You can have glimmers of an awareness of that kind of unity. And then you talk about it and it's gone. Because by definition, the symbol we use for the word is something other than God. And you see what I'm saying? So there's this tension.
I think this is where the Christians, early Christians, developed the idea of Jesus, because it's a form of God that you can see and visualize as a person or a being, rather than something that you just can't tell what it is. It's just, God is nothing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the ways of understanding why Jesus is so compelling as a way of talking about God is that Jesus is a buddy God. Jesus, you hear, listen to Chris, Jesus walks with me through life. And it's not a metaphor, because he was a human being. Right? That's compelling. It's a lot easier than what we're called upon to do with our more abstract divine, right? It's what we're called upon is more difficult. A less, how can I put it? I'm not making any judgments if I say it this way, is essentially that, I really think that what we're called upon as Jews to think about theologically is impossible. And so there's this constant sort of back and forth, this striving towards believing for a unified God, and then stepping back a little bit to talk about it. Right? It's this sort of, and that's about the best we can do. So that's the one tension that you brought. And you're right, essentially, whether we're talking about Judaism or Christianity, they're both ultimately created out of the prophets. Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity are really created to a large degree. The fuel is out of the prophets. And really Isaiah, right there. We're seeing a little bit of a different side of Isaiah. We're not seeing his social justice agenda, which is what we learn more about in the Reform movement. This guy's a prophet. And his prophecy often takes the form of visionary mysticism. It's one of the major ways that he experiences God. Ezekiel as well in the opening passage when he has the vision of the angels in the chariot. Right? So this is very much a part. And what I'm going to show is that it continues in Judaism, although Reform Judaism in its extreme 19th century German rationalism just chucks all this out. Right? So this is something, one of the things that we lost by being so a part of 19th century German intellectualism in our creation as Reformed Jews. Look, I'm the rabbi of Sinai. We're the pillar of 19th century German rationalism to this day. Right? So very much. But I think it's good to recognize the, how could I put it, the weaknesses of one's position. Right? That's how one grows stronger. It's a classic rhetorical move. You acknowledge the weakness of your argument in your talk. Right? And you address it. Just because then your opponents can't bring it up afterwards in the Q&A. You hope.
Is the reason that the prophets did this is they felt sorry for us ordinary Jews to make it easier to say, well, since you want us to believe in this floating something or other out there, where he does condense himself and make these little things so that you can see it. I just think they felt sorry for us. And they, well, we've got to give you a little hook. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think the prophets have had really powerful experiences with God, and they're psyched about it. I mean, if you had an experience like this, I'd be like running through the streets telling everyone, "This is cool." I think that's some of it. That when one has a heightened experience, it's something that you want to share. We had to say, I saw my grandkids last week. Right? And you just want to tell everybody. Right? And this is another takeaway here. The examples that I'm giving today are quite extreme examples. I have never seen the throne of God. I don't know about you guys, but I have not. But I have had certain heightened experiences in life which I associate with experiencing divinity. All right, and I'll give an example. I was watching, this is actually in a spot that's a holy spot. St. Francis had a bench on top of a hill outside of Assisi where he would go and sit and look at the sunset. I was talking with a monk in Assisi, and he told me, look, the sunset's in an hour and a half. You got enough time to get up to the bench. You got to go up to the bench. So I hike up there, and just the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen in my life. I'm sitting in, Italy's such an amazing place, right? And to see this sunset, and some of it was powerful in the sense that I knew I was sitting in the same place as a spiritual adept, one from a different religion that I don't believe in, but nonetheless a spiritual adept. And it was a very powerful experience to sit and look at that beautiful nature, and I really understood that in the context of God's presence in the world and the beauty that it creates. And it was a heightened experience that really energized me for quite a while. So nature is one of the ways that we often have these. Can you think of other ways that we sort of in our everyday life have heightened experiences, which we may not be thinking of in these terms, right? What are our see the throne of God moments is essentially what I'm asking. Please, go back.
Sometimes when in our everyday life, we have things that happen to us, and they go, if this didn't happen, the other alternative would have been catastrophic, or the other alternative, or what happened was that led us down the road of something absolutely beautiful and wonderful, meeting somebody, or something like that. So things that you think that there was a divine hand in that incidence.
Right, that's a choice to not see the system as completely random. And with that comes a change of perspective that can be powerful, and you live life differently with that perspective as to seeing things totally random. Right?
In Yiddish, it's called beshert.
Yeah, the beshert is this thing, that's like, it's sort of like, it's fate light. Because Judaism so strongly believes in free will that we can't go all the way, we can't become Calvinists, right? So it's sort of fate light, this idea of beshert, absolutely.
I have two things that come to mind, but both of them seem to be interpersonal. And one is with little people, grandchildren or children.
Right.
That there's somehow this magical joy from a hug that transfers between just a connection that is unlike anything else. Unlike anything else. So that moves me into being better, which again I feel is a spiritual movement. The other thing is interpersonal relationships that offer clarity, or teaches me something. When that light comes on, or I'm totally present, and I see things with I have a new understanding, or a motivation to learn more. I also feel that was a spiritual moment. So is that God present? It's
your choice. I'm making the argument that it's more powerful if you bring that in as well. But not surprisingly, if we're talking about all of these lenses that we have to look at the universe, the religious one is one that's very important to me. It shouldn't be a surprise, I'm a rabbi, right? But therapists may have a different answer. But yeah, strong relational moments can be really powerful. At moments when our hearts are open and the smallest emotional exchange can be just devastatingly beautiful. Where it breaks you apart and pulls you together in the same moment. A friend travels, 2,000 miles to be there at your father's funeral. And when they look in your eyes and hold your hand, they don't even have to say anything. And you just break, right? And these are these very powerful human connection moments can have that feeling. So this is I taught a teaching by the Ishbitzer Rabbi last Thursday that talked about this in the case of using the example of last week's Torah portion, Teruma, which is the Torah portion that the Federation loves so much because it says that we all have to donate. Right? So it's essentially saying voluntary donations for the building of the Mishkan. And what the Ishbitzer says is that it's not about the money. But what it is, the material is a means. That if we give, that creates an empty space in our souls. And that allows the possibility for that empty space to be filled in with relationships, with community. That allows for that empty space to be filled in with divinity, with God. And that's why we give. You have to dig a hole before you build a house. Right? It's a beautiful and very, very simple teaching about how essentially relationship works, whether it be relationship with other human beings or God. You have to give first. Take that lead. So yeah, relationships can be another way where we experience this. We have nature, we have relationships. When I talked about this when I was teaching a class with undergrads at Stanford, football player stood up and had an incredibly impassioned monologue about what it is to be out there in the field when there's 80,000 people surrounding him? I no doubt. Wasn't what I was thinking, right? As far as the examples I thought I was going to hear, but he got it. And that's the way that he connected. It was a heightened experience. And he really saw that as connecting him with God in a very sort of Southern evangelical Christian way, which was foreign to me, but nonetheless, connecting with God. All right? Any other ideas?
A lot of people have heard of the Jerusalem syndrome. When people walk the streets of Jerusalem, you see these people who are prophets, who say they're prophets, and they're sometimes carted off to as a hospital, and sometimes allowed to walk free. I lived in the Jewish quarter for 8 months, 25 years ago. I cannot tell you, and I never thought about it in these terms of how often I felt that I wasn't this 20th century person, but I was someone else in a place where I'm supposed to be anyway. This happened to me on my way from my apartment to the store in which I worked, which is like 200 yards away. It happened when I would walk down to the hotel in the middle of the night because I couldn't sleep. And I had this happen all the time, and I never talked about this part of my experience living in Israel. It happened so often that I was going to check myself in.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah, you're starting to be concerned because you're holding the psychological lens as a primary way that you understand the world. And the psychological lens is telling you that's aberrant.
Right.
And it's something to be concerned about, right? Where the religious lens would step in and basically say, are you hurting anyone? Are you hurting yourself? Is this helping you? Is these type of
interfering with your life?
Is it interfering with your life? And as long as you're answering all those questions in a positive way, run with it. Right? So obviously you did, and I think what I'm saying is that's the right answer. It's important to do that check and ask those questions. Needless to say, right? Do a check-in with yourself. Make a decision as to whether there's someone else you can talk to about this, right? Or maybe you don't even need to, right? No, it's interesting. And I'm a collector of religious experiences. I read about them. This is something that fascinates me. There was a science fiction writer in the early 70s named Philip K. Dick who had a very similar type experience. He had it when he was in Northern California. And he periodically, and there would be certain things that would trigger it, would have a feeling that he was living in first century Israel. And ultimately, because clarity, you use that word, clarity was what was coming out of this awareness for him, not chaos. He went with it, right? There's a point where it moved to chaos with him. So it's a gamble when we run with experiences like this, right? But so I've read one particular account of a mystical experience or a series of mystical experiences that was similar. I don't have a way to explain that, obviously.
I don't need an explanation.
And you don't need it. I don't think that's the productive way to go. That's science stepping in. We want to explain. No, that's not productive. It's not explain. Is it beneficial? Am I getting clarity out of this?
And on a cold winter's night, I will reflect on that.
And you carry it with you the rest of your life.
Yes.
That's the other powerful thing that you're describing about mystical experiences, is that they stay with you and can be a source of spiritual energy throughout one's life. Like, not everybody has these things, obviously, right? That's just the reality. Some are more cued into it than others, and I don't understand the whys and wherefores of that. But it can be something that you then carry through for the rest of your life. And we're talking about a much more grand scale mystical experience. But what I'm saying, even the small ones too, can be these things that fuel our spiritual practice. So that feeling of being with the grandchild can be something that fuels our spiritual practice. That's God energy. I'm sounding very California. That's God energy. But I stepped out and made fun of myself a little bit, but I also mean it. All right? So another very you had one.
I was going to say before you start talking that every time I go to Israel,
So
there was one point where I was standing on a mountain and I'm looking at this expanse of beauty.
Mhm.
And something happened within me that I to this day can't explain. But now that you're talking about it, I think it like took me to a different level that I've never been to before.
Yeah.
This gorgeousness there, this feeling of the whole land was, and it was land. I wasn't seeing cities, I wasn't seeing places, I
Yeah.
just.
No, there's when you read the writings of Achad Ha'am, who was a cultural Zionist, and he talks about the land. And when he talks about the land, he's not talking about a map. He's talking about putting his fingers in the dirt and what that feels like when he's in Israel. For him, that was the highest mystical experience possible, putting the fingers in the dirt. And the idea that a Jew was living there was just so powerful to him. And for him, it was the most tangible part of it that really fired him. It wasn't anything abstract, it was literally his hand in the dirt. It's just gorgeous.
I just thought of like the difference between the Christianity and when they're mystical
Mhm.
experiences, that a lot of times they're connected with objects. You know, like they have books and
Mhm.
things about the
Mhm.
cup, the robe,
Right.
the cup, the robe, the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Even that's kind of, we don't have things. We're not looking like crazy people looking for the rod of Moses.
One of
You
the
know,
ways, one of the ways to trigger this kind of experience is through sort of an intermediary of some sort, an object. One of the most standard ways that this is done in Jewish mystical practices is through the word, through letters. All right, that's what Abu Lafia did. I mentioned going off into the barn in Iowa and studying Abu Lafia. There's a guy back in the 90s who actually did that and had his little group of followers sitting in a barn in Iowa doing these very complex meditation techniques where you're doing, it's essentially mathematical permutations involving the names of God, where you make magic cubes. And there's breathing motions and head motions that go with it. Very complex stuff. And you sit and you do it for 6 to 10 hours a day. And then you off to Lululand. Maybe, maybe not, right? But that's a case, I bring that up only because Jewish mysticism tends to use symbols as the means as opposed to objects, which makes sense with our theology. Since the way we think about God resists objects. I'm surprised that nobody has mentioned the arts, because that's another very common way that people have experiences like this. I saw Zubin Mehta conduct Mahler's Second when I was in my 20s. As someone who wasn't even a particular fan of classical music and didn't know Mahler from Schmaler, right? And it really moved me. And that's a piece of music. So that we can have those kinds of moments. So, as someone who's seen the Grateful Dead 11 times, right? That's a different kind of communal music moment that can be very powerful. Okay, with what the hippies created at the Fillmore and in those old theater houses in San Francisco in '66 and '67 was a very powerful communal heightened experience. Because if you talk, when I was I was a rabbi in Palo Alto for 7 years, and a lot of my congregants had been involved in that scene then. And I talked to them, and I'd always want to talk about the bands because I love music so much, and they'd be like, "It wasn't about the bands. It was the whole thing." And I got to get, that's it, that's the mystical awareness thing. It's the whole, it was the whole experience of the moment, where, essentially there's a breakdown, as they described it, between awareness of self and environment. And that's described to me by a number of them. This is a particular case where I suspect, although they didn't tell me, since these were all now, very dignified aging engineers living in Palo Alto, but I do suspect that there was some chemical enhancement involved in this experience. But I didn't ask so that they wouldn't, be embarrassed as far as the answer. Don't ask, don't tell, exactly.
Okay, so I'm trying to formulate some emotion now that we are sharing this.
Mhm.
I think that what happens to me when I define myself as having a spiritual moment is I take the time to see, it's almost a macro-micro feeling.
That's what I just played with a little
Yes,
bit, right? And
yes.
this macro-micro tension and a paradox with it
Yes,
is often a key component of mystical experience.
right, that I am part of something
And you
forever.
brought it too.
Yeah.
It's me, but there's this thing that's bigger. But I'm the thing that's bigger. But the thing that's bigger is me. But
Or I can affect change within that bigger something.
and I can play a little bit with that.
I feel that way in the sanctuary when I'm sitting in a service.
Yeah, and that's that's what we're in a good service. That's what we're going for,
That's right, we have
right?
it. We have it here.
And we've gotten in Reform Judaism where in many temples that's not necessarily a goal. That's not what's at play. All right? I'm not saying in yours. All right? And I think it's important to have that as a part of worship. My older congregants do find it in our organ and choir service. They grew up with it. It's this incredible, it has, for them, it's something that has accompanied them on their lives. So it has that macro feeling over time. And what they tell me, it's interesting, for me, in leading services, I get it, that feeling out of being a facilitator. I'm not having it, it's not the service that's doing it for me. It's leading their experience with the service that gives it to me. It took me a while to figure that out. For a while I was a bit of a robot leading services until I got that. Again, something they don't teach you at school. The moment in the classical Reform service is the silent prayer. You grew up in Reform synagogues, many of you, so you know that that's really the culmination moment where it builds, and then just, boom, it drops out, and you're left with yourself. Which is scary, right? And that's a very well-designed service of a sort. But you have to know that's what it's doing to have that experience. But yeah, religious services hopefully are the ways that we could do this, or communal prayer, let's just say. So to go back to the Kedusha, and to go back to this text since we're at communal prayer. This was great. Thank you so much for opening up and sharing. This is a bit of a risky lesson because the power of the lesson really depends on you guys opening up, right? And I thought to myself, well, it's my third year here. They know me. They probably trust me some. I can go for it here. I wouldn't have done this in the first lesson. It would have been like belly flopped in the pool, right? All right. So thank you for opening up. So if we go back to the Kedusha for a second, and what I'm going to talk about, since I just talked about the way classical Reform does it, I'm going to talk about the way Hasidim say the Kedusha on a Saturday morning, or really on any morning. Because it partakes very much of this text in a stronger way than our Reform practice does, whether in classical Reform or here. So Hasidim would be standing it would be said during the repetition of the Amidah. We say the Amidah twice traditionally, right? The standing prayer, which begins with the Avot V'Imahot and ends with Oseh Shalom. So they would be standing during the repetition. They'd be standing. And talis, big black and white talisim, talitot, over their heads and streaming down. So what you have is an image of white and black. The tzitzit, of course, are going down. The fringes. And in the part where the Shliach Tzibur, the leader of the prayer, is saying his part before they say their part, they'll be swaying side to side. So the image is of white wings. Because you have the talus and the tzitzi. So there's all these white wings flashing, right? Then when it's their time to say Kadosh, 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 they express their desire to elevate to the heavenly temple and to be among the seraphim by raising on their toes. Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Some of you probably do that, but don't know why you're doing it. Now you know why you're doing it. Right? It's important to learn the whys and wherefores. It brings more meaning, of course, right? And then back to being the, imitating the angels. So really what they're trying to do is create a simulacra, a simulation of that moment described in Isaiah, where heaven and earth are connected, through the nexus of the temple and the holy temple. That's something a lot different than saying Kadosh, 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 and moving on, right? Intentionality in prayer, what we bring to it, is so important as far as cultivating a different kind of experience. Okay? Again, I'm not suggesting that you're going to have visions of the heavenly host the next time you say Kedusha, right? But you're going to be thinking about different stuff next time you say Kedusha, right? And work with that a little bit and see where it takes you. All right. So where did my page go? I'm a walker, you probably noticed that. When I think, my legs move. When I was writing my dissertation, I would set an alarm for every 45 minutes. And then I would walk for the next 15 and think. And then I'd sit back down and write for 45. Because for whatever reason, moving my body then moved the thought forward. So that was my ritualized writing of my dissertation. I did not enjoy writing my dissertation. It was not a mystical experience.
What was it on?
Tractate Nazir of the Talmud Nazarite vows. So a fairly obscure topic, as most dissertations are. So the ideas that I was dealing with were much more exciting. I mean, what I was really trying to think about is how do religious practices change when religious groups encounter other religious groups? So what is the encounter with Greco-Roman culture? What does the encounter with Christianity? How does that change the biblical Nazarite vow? And those are questions obviously really still alive in our contemporary society or in any Jewish community. So my broad theoretical framework was sort of the part that was interesting to think with. My example wasn't the most thrilling thing in the world, a little bit dry. So. All right, so let's go to page 2, which is on the back there. These are some texts that aren't translated. How much time do we have here? I don't think we're going to get to the Christianity. Yeah, we're definitely not going to get to it. That's okay. Better to have too much than too little. All right. And if we're going to make cuts, it should be the Christianity. Right? So there are a group of mystics. We don't know exactly, we don't know where, we don't know when, we don't know who. The disagreement is why. Were these guys living in what we call Babylonia? Were they living in present-day Iraq and the Tigris-Euphrates Delta, or were they living in the land of Israel? Those are the two major Jewish centers in the late ancient world, right? So where were they? Debates among scholars. When were they operating? Oh, roughly between the 3rd and the 11th century. I mean, not a very small span of time there, right? Scholars debate about an 800-year period as to when this operated. Who were these guys? Well, they're Jews. That's about all we know. Some say that they're rabbinic Jews. Some say that the rabbinic attributions were added to these texts by later rabbis, and in fact, they're non-rabbinic Jews. And there were non-rabbinic Jews for quite a while. In any case, what we're really looking at are the first sort of strong suit the first Kabbalistic text that we have to talk about mystical experience. It's generally called the Hechalot literature. And this is from a collection of this material called Hechalot Rabbi, or the Great Hechalot. All right. So what are these guys doing? We know that they're engaging in varieties of mystical prayer. Right? So that's why I did this whole intro about Kedusha and mystical prayer. We know that they also have some other techniques that they're doing in order to have visions of the divine throne and the divine temple, which is the goal. They're putting their head between their knees and getting up really quick over and over again. That'll throw you up. So they're actually, in this case, they're using biology to give it a little kick in the pants, right? What we call a head rush or whatever it may be, right? To make one's head light and see stars and hoping, so they're actually using some physical techniques, we know. And their goal is to see the God sitting on the throne, and also the Merkabah, which is a difficult word to translate. This is what God's throne is sitting on, is the Merkabah. It means, it's often translated chariot, which is an okay translation. I'm going to be more vague than that. It's, how can I put it? It's the divine transportation device. Right? And since in the social context, chariot would work, right? It's probably not wrong. And in other rabbinic literature, they use this word Merkabah for chariot, right? But I think the translator, when they use chariot, is probably being a bit too specific. And if we go with divine transportation device, the means by which God, as he's sitting in his throne, moves about the temple and the heavens, we're probably closer. I think keeping it a little more vague is probably a better way to go. So the first time here I didn't translate it, and I left the word Merkabah, although later down I think, use the word chariot. So I brought this, the other question is that they use the words for going to the heavens and having these visions, they use the verb descend. So what to do with that? You descend into the Merkabah. You descend into the heavens. All right? I think what we're working with here is the micro-macro paradox. Are you going in? Or are you going out? Are you going up? Or are you going down into the depths of the soul? Up into the heavens, down into the depths of the soul. I think with this language of descend to the heavens, they're playing. And they're saying, yeah, the nexus of this is the micro-macro. It's playing with paradox that gets you to this place, and the experience of this place is paradox. So one descends to the heavens. That's what I think. All right. Nobody really knows about this stuff. As I said, it's incredibly obscure material, and this is a great body of literature to be essentially to be teaching about, because we're never going to find out the answers about it, which is an ideal place to be in academia. You've got a job for the rest of your life. Nobody's going to solve your questions, right? Scientists, poor Einstein, he got the theory of relativity in his early 20s, then he sat around at Princeton failing at gravitation for the rest of his career, right? He obviously did some other things than fail at gravitation, I'm overstating. But this is the tough part about science, is that there are definite answers. The wonderful part about religion is that really what we deal with are the things you can't answer, which keeps me in business. So, in any case, there's a practical repercussion. So what we're describing here, I believe, is the morning prayer practice of this group. All right? And it's done in a very obtuse way, but I think that's what's going on here. All right? So Rabbi Ishmael said, what is the order of the songs that a man sings when he goes down and enters the Merkabah? Right, so there's an order of songs, or shirim, right? The opening part of the morning prayer service is Pesukei de Zimra, sections of song. Unfortunately, the Reform movement chucked this out. We really don't do it. It's back a little bit in Mishkan Tefillah and sort of a so-so kind, well, I'd say a slightly below so-so kind of way. At least they brought a little bit of it back.
What about Matovu?
Yeah, Matovu, we say Matovu, you're absolutely right, that's left, but that's not a psalm. It's, really what Pesukei de Zimra is a collection of psalms. And there's different ones on the weekday and on the Shabbos service. But in a good traditional service, the singing of those opening psalms on the Saturday morning Shabbat service is really an amazing part of the service. There is a service in Jerusalem where that was really the whole thing. They would sing those psalms for like 4 hours. And then they just tear through the rest of the service in like 45 minutes, just like they gotta have lunch. It's like 1 in the afternoon, right? And so the whole point being that it's the belief in this, the joy that comes out of singing these opening psalms is really the religious experience of the Saturday morning service. They also focused a lot on Yotzer, which is a prayer, the prayer that talks about creation before saying the Shema, and the traditional Shabbat version of that has lots of angelology. Partakes also of visionary mysticism. Okay, so in that particular service. So the singing of these psalms. So I think that's what's going on. We start out by singing psalms, to get ourselves into this heightened state.
We sing nigunim.
Yeah,
for ourselves.
so singing nigunim as a warm-up. There's a recognition now in the Reform movement that if you're going for a spiritual experience, you got to do something to warm them up. Singing matovu, doing nigunim, which is essentially a Hasidic technique. We're taking that straight from Kabbalah, these wordless psalms.
It's great with kids.
Well, yeah, because they don't have to learn the words.
They're wordless.
That's why the Reform movement took them in ultimately, is it's a way you can have a real spiritual experience if you don't have a drop of Hebrew, which works well with our crowd. You can participate with it. When you have a goal of participation and you may not have a high level of knowledge about the tradition, what do we do? Right? That's a question that contemporary Reform it goes after. And nigunim, or these wordless songs, has been one way to do this. Or the singing of psalms. There's the one psalm, Psalm 150, which is basically the word hallelujah over and over again. I'm sure you guys do that sometimes, right? That's from the traditional Pesukei de Zimra. That's the one thing that's come back into the Reform movement. And again, it's because it's easy to do, because it's really just saying hallelujah over and over again, right? So you can do it. We're like, Ashrei hasn't really made it back in because the Hebrew's really hard. Do Ashrei, good for you. But that's a chant that gives you some of the idea, right? It's a repetition to the thing, right? Okay. So all these things we're talking about ultimately is what these guys are doing. They sort of rev themselves up. They're chanting. Right? I mean, if we think about it in sort of Buddhist context, they're chanting, right? They're revving up the engine, so to speak. The other thing is that all the psalms that they pick are ones that are talking about joy and winning. They don't do this. They don't put the psalms in where David's bummed out. That ends up in the funeral service, right? No, and that's it. David has his really heartbroken moments, or David in quotes, right? Has his very heartbroken moments, and there are some psalms that are really talking about pulling yourself out of the depths, and they really bring you there. And thank God they're there, because they're very powerful. These times, I lift up my eyes to the mountain. Where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, right? Psalm 121.
Sinai.
Exactly, Sinai. That's one of those sort of, I'm feeling lousy and I need some help psalms. The psalms in this are the, I'm feeling great today. God's with me, right? The Beshert psalms. doesn't always feel the share. So they're singing those. They're arousing joys and praise. The servants sing the songs during every day to Adonai, the God of Israel, and to the throne of his glory. All right? So now we see what the goal here is. We're singing these songs to the throne of the glory. We're hoping that we get there. We want to get there. All right? So they raise the wheel of the throne of his glory. All right, we're there. So there appears to be a wheel on the vehicle. Okay? This stuff's hard to interpret. We have to take it. This is part of the vision. Rejoice, rejoice, uppermost dwelling. Shout out, beloved vessel that is made miraculously. So we're essentially praising the Merkabah. We're praising the divine motion vehicle. Okay? Transportation vehicle. A miracle. Gladden the king who's upon you, like the joy of the bridegroom on his bridal chamber. Okay? There's a little bit of sex mysticism going on here. The Merkabah is feminine, God is masculine. Unification of the Merkabah and the divine. We're getting a little bit of an allusion to sexual imagery. Very common in mysticism and very common in Kabbalah. May all the offspring of Jacob gladden and rejoice, and when I've come to hide under the shadow of your wings, anyone recognize that from El Malay Rachamim, right? With the happiness of the heart that rejoices with you, for your conversation is with the conversation of your king, and with your creator you speak, as it is said, holy, holy is the God of hosts. All right, so we have now re-envisioned the saying of those words as conversation with the divine. It's pretty powerful. All right? As you can see, this is not the most, as with most mystical accounts, this is not the most clear stuff in the world. Right? It's not the easiest material. So then the adepts who've traveled up to the heavens are elevated, exalted with strength, power, and might. You get something from being a spiritual adept. Having these experiences, to put it in our way, you end up carrying something back with you that you can carry in your life. Right? And that was something that we talked about. And also they did not place their feet upon the ground of the seventh heaven, rather as birds flying and standing under it. So when you're up in the heavens, you're not walking, you fly like the angels. So they're getting to float around in the heavens. That's part of this experience. And 3 times during each day and every day, your throne of glory prostrates itself before you and says to you. So during the 3 times when the Jews pray, the divine throne bows down to God and calls out the names of angels. Ohariel, Zohariel, Adonai God of Israel, exalt yourself and sit upon me crowned. So what's going on here ultimately is that through the prayers of Israel, God is being placed upon the throne. We place God upon the throne with our prayers. King, because your burden is precious to me, and there's no heaviness upon me, as it is said, holy, holy, holy is Adonai of hosts. When we're saying the Kedusha, we're enthroning God. This is actually participating in very, very old ancient Mesopotamian mythology, which we also associate with Rosh Hashanah, the traditional liturgy. We enthrone the king on Rosh Hashanah morning. And there are Akkadian pagan texts that are pre-Jewish from up in Mesopotamia, where they have similar language for the yearly enthroning at the new year of their divine king. So it's funny how where all this stuff comes from. We're really playing with ancient Akkadian paganism that's sort of come in through the Babylonian exile and now is sitting inside this mystical material. The rabbis bring it into Rosh Hashanah. So it's not just these weirdos who are doing it, like more middle-of-the-road Judaism does it as well. So you're blessed by me, heaven and earth. All right, so here's the thing, and this is the key of how all mysticism works. What did we do? We said prayers. The result was enthroning God. What's the result? God gives blessing to us. All right? This is called, in religious studies, we call this theurgy. And it's the basic premise, one of the basic premises of Jewish mysticism is that we as human beings in our actions, by performing mitzvot, can affect divinity. That's why we're doing it. God can't do it by himself. We say prayers at the commanded times, thereby putting God back in his holy vehicle. He likes his car. He's happy to be sitting in the driver's seat. Right? So he responds by giving us blessing for letting him drive his car. It's the basic understanding that flows through. We're sitting here at the earliest strata. If you went, over to Dundee Road to Chabad and sat down and studied Hasidus with them whenever they do it this week, this lesson would be taught there sometime this week. It's still a central teaching of Kabbalah. All right, this is just carrying through. I call it the theurgic revolution. And it is incredibly revolutionary in that it gives a tremendous amount of power to human beings. I'm going to use this as my closer. This is a really good sermonette, so I'm going to give it. I'm sorry, I'm complimenting myself too much. But I had a little spark of an idea, and I was pleased with myself.
Divine intervention.
This is one of the major contributions that Kabbalah and mysticism can give to Reform Judaism, is to use the colloquialism as it gives the power to the people. All right? We have it. It's up to us. I mean, this is a basic premise of Reform Judaism, although we tend to channel it more into our social justice agenda as opposed to into mitzvot. But since this class is about mitzvot, I'm channeling it into mitzvot. Probably would do it differently if I taught it at my synagogue. We're channeling it into mitzvot here. This whole idea that doing the mitzvot, defined in the widest way possible, since we're Reformed Jews, right? I'm not telling everybody to have their suits checked for shotness to make sure that there's no wool and linen mixed in them, all right? That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is our spiritual practices, our mitzvot, things that we feel commanded to do, see them as having a profound effect on the universe. Because they do. They change the universe. They have an effect on the role that divinity has in the world. Divinity as the power that makes for redemption, the power in the world which makes things better, is affected by us doing these things. And there's a result. We get better, the world gets better. And as we get better, we're more able to do more of this. And the wheel gets stronger. This is an incredibly profound observation today. And I believe in it so strongly with my heart because I have seen over and over again individuals and communities get stronger when they throw themselves essentially into trying to search for the right language. Your mitzvot, defined in what you feel that you need to do as a spiritual practice. And that's ultimately the path. I am an optimist. I actually believe that it's possible for the world to be perfected. I don't think it's going to happen by Jesus walking through the door. I don't think it's going to happen through Schneerson walking through the door. I don't think it's going to happen through the Messiah walking through the door, in other words. I'm a Reformed Jew. How I think it's going to happen is through a myriad of small actions. And at one point, there's going to be a tipping point, right? Somebody's going to hug a grandkid, and something radical will happen. We'll be over the tipping point, and the world will be lived differently. It may be just like it is now, as far as our empirical, our eyes and ears show us, but the world will be lived differently. And we are capable, ultimately, of capturing moments of that experience. And I think that's what we're getting with these heightened experiences, is a glimmer of that possibility. So they're incredible gifts when we get them. All right, so that's it. I can't say more than that. So.